There are stories that do not ask to be believed. They ask only to be remembered. Tonight is not about answers. It is about the quiet space where evidence ends and memory begins. As the world outside slows, allow your attention to loosen its grip on certainty. Ancient people watched the sky with fear and reverence, not because they understood it, but because it could change everything without warning. You are safe here. You don't need to hold every detail. Some truths arrive softly, and some only reveal themselves when we stop trying to force meaning upon them. Long before maps fixed borders and calendars disciplined memory, catastrophe arrived without explanation. Cities did not fade. They were erased. Entire populations vanished in a single generation, leaving behind layers of silence pressed into the earth. For those who survived, language itself struggled to contain what had been witnessed. They did not speak of mechanisms or measurements. They spoke of fire, of storms, of judgment descending from the sky. If this quiet exploration feels like a place you may wish to return to, you are welcome to subscribe, not as an obligation, but as a gentle way of walking these long corridors of memory together whenever the night feels wide and restless. In the basements of museums and universities, thousands of clay tablets sleep beneath fluorescent lights. They are cataloged, numbered, translated, debated. Yet some of them resist neat classification. One such tablet, written in careful wedge-shaped impressions nearly 4,000 years ago, does not record a king's victory or a trade agreement. It mourns. It speaks of cities that fell together, not one by one, but all at once, as if struck by a single, overwhelming force. The scribes who composed these laments were not poets indulging fantasy. They were bureaucrats of memory, trained to record harvests, omens, eclipses, and legal disputes with ruthless precision. When they described walls collapsing as if struck by a divine hand, when they wrote of fire raining down and land becoming bitter with salt, they were reaching for the closest language available to describe something that shattered normal experience. For centuries, scholars treated these words as metaphor, ancient exaggeration, religious theater, a way of framing political collapse as divine will, and perhaps that is partly true. Ancient people did not separate the natural from the supernatural the way modern minds insist upon, but metaphor does not require melted stone. Poetry alone does not vitrify pottery or fragment human bodies beyond recognition. Far to the west of Mesopotamia, in the Jordan Valley near the still waters of the Dead Sea, the ground tells a story that does not ask permission from belief. It speaks through ash, through warped clay, through cities abandoned so completely that even memory hesitated to return. A place where life once thrived, and then abruptly did not. What happened there was not gradual. It was not patient. And whatever descended upon that land left marks that would echo for thousands of years, waiting for someone to notice that ancient words and buried ruins were whispering the same unease. And this is where our story truly begins. Our story begins where certainty dissolves into sediment. Layer by layer, the earth preserves moments humans tried to forget. In the Jordan Valley, the soil does not whisper. It testifies. Beneath centuries of dust and silence lies a city that once commanded trade routes, agriculture, and political gravity in the Bronze Age world. Its name today is Tall el-Hammam, but long before modern labels, it was simply a place where people lived, worked, prayed, and expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday. For decades, archaeologists returned to this mound with familiar expectations. They anticipated defensive walls, domestic quarters, storage rooms, the predictable rhythms of urban life interrupted by warfare or decline. And at first, that is what they found. Streets aligned with intention. Walls thick enough to support multi-story buildings. Evidence of prosperity sustained across generations. Nothing in the early layers suggested anomaly. Nothing warned of what waited above. Then came the layer that did not belong. It announced itself not through subtlety, but through rupture. A horizon of destruction so abrupt, it sliced history cleanly in two. Mud bricks that should have crumbled into powder had instead fused, their surfaces glazed as if brushed by liquid fire. Pottery vessels, once shaped by steady hands, had warped and bubbled, their edges softened beyond recognition. These were not the remains of a city burned slowly. They were the remains of a city transformed in an instant. The temperature required to produce such effects exceeded anything known from Bronze Age kilns or warfare. Experimental archaeology would later confirm this, replicating fragments under controlled conditions. The results pointed toward heat levels surpassing 2,000 degrees Celsius, not sustained heat, not gradual exposure, but sudden, overwhelming intensity. Human remains told an even quieter story. Bodies were not found intact. Skeletons were scattered, fragmented, disarticulated in ways that defied conventional explanations. There were no signs of famine, no evidence of disease, no indications of prolonged siege. People had been going about ordinary life when everything ended. Whatever happened did not give them time to understand it. Above this destruction layer, something else emerged. Absence. For centuries after the event, the land resisted reoccupation. Fields that once produced grain lay barren. Settlements that should have followed the pattern of renewal simply did not return. Archaeologists call this a gap, but the word feels insufficient. It was more than a pause. It was a refusal. Soil samples revealed elevated salt concentrations, not in patterns consistent with natural salinization from the nearby Dead Sea, but dispersed across wide areas as if lifted and scattered through the air. Agriculture struggles in such conditions. Seeds fail, roots burn, life hesitates. The land remembers even when people move on. Initially, scholars proposed familiar explanations. Earthquake, warfare, accidental fire intensified by bitumen deposits. Each theory accounted for some details, but none accounted for all. Earthquakes do not melt pottery. Warfare leaves weapons, fortifications breached, patterns of human conflict. Fires consume structures unevenly. What happened here was comprehensive, directional, and strangely clean in its finality. As questions deepened, attention turned upward. Not in superstition, but in physics. Airbursts, cosmic events. Objects entering the atmosphere at unimaginable speeds, detonating before impact, releasing energy across wide areas without leaving a crater. The comparison to Tunguska arose not because of sensationalism, but because it fit the pattern of sudden devastation without an obvious source. And yet, even this explanation unsettled, because the destruction was not random. It was localized, focused. Cities within a specific radius were abandoned simultaneously, while regions just beyond survived. Chance allows this, but chance also leaves room for doubt. Ancient people, faced with such an event, would not have spoken of asteroids or shock waves. They would have spoken of gods, of decrees, of fire from the heavens, not because they were naive, but because they were translating trauma into meaning. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, scribes pressed similar memories into clay, unaware that one day buried cities and ancient words would be asked to speak to each other across time. Across the long arc of human memory, disaster does not vanish. It compresses. It hardens into story. When the survivors of tall el-Hammam fled the valley, they carried little with them besides fear, loss, and fragments of explanation. Generations later, when children asked why no one returned to those fields, the answers would not have been technical. They would have been sacred. The land was cursed. The sky had spoken. Something beyond human authority had intervened. In Mesopotamia, far from the Jordan Valley, scribes were performing a similar act of compression. They were not eyewitnesses to a single event, but inheritors of a remembered rupture. The city laments they composed were not spontaneous outpourings of grief. They followed a structure, an order. They named cities. They named gods. They described a sequence: decision, descent, destruction, aftermath. What makes these texts unsettling is not their theology, but their consistency. Multiple compositions, written at different times, preserved in fragments scattered across ruins, repeat the same pattern. The gods assemble. A verdict is rendered. A force descends from above. Fire moves through the city faster than people can flee. Buildings collapse. Bodies are scattered. And afterward, the land itself changes, becoming hostile to life. Scholars have long noted that ancient Near Eastern literature frequently used storms as metaphors for invasion. Armies moved like tempests. Kings boasted of cities flattened as if by wind. But the laments resist this framework in subtle ways. They emphasize that this destruction was not carried out by human hands. Weapons are mentioned only to be dismissed. The usual markers of warfare are absent. There is no victorious king, no plunder, no new regime. Instead, there is abandonment, gods leaving their temples, silence settling where ritual once filled the air. The texts linger on emptiness, on the unnatural stillness of places designed for life. This is not how conquest is usually remembered. It is how catastrophe is remembered. Language itself strains in these passages. Words are repurposed. A single term can mean storm, army, or overwhelming force depending on context. Another can mean day, heat, or blinding light. The scribes were not being evasive. They were reaching for meaning with a vocabulary built for a different world. Their reality had exceeded their grammar. Modern readers often underestimate ancient observational capacity. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with astonishing precision. They recorded eclipses, conjunctions, and omens tied to celestial events. They understood that the sky was not static. It moved, it changed, and sometimes it threatened. When something arrived from above, they noticed. This does not mean they understood causation in modern terms. It means they were attentive witnesses. If a sudden explosion of light appeared in the sky, followed by heat, wind, and devastation, they would not have lacked the language to describe it. They would have lacked only the framework to explain it without invoking the divine. The danger lies in forcing their words into modern categories. To read these texts as literal descriptions of advanced technology is as flawed as dismissing them entirely as myth. They exist in a middle space, a record of experience filtered through belief, trauma translated into cosmology. What matters is not whether the gods of these texts were real in a literal sense, but whether the events that inspired the texts were. And when archaeology uncovers cities destroyed in ways that defy conventional explanation, the distance between ancient lament and physical evidence narrows uncomfortably. Tall el-Hammam was not unique in its fate. Within a relatively small radius, multiple settlements show signs of abrupt abandonment within the same period. This pattern mirrors the lament's insistence on simultaneity. Cities falling together. A coordinated end. Whether this coordination came from nature or something else remains unresolved. The past does not offer conclusions easily. It offers correspondences, echoes, moments where separate lines of evidence lean toward one another without fully touching. And in that narrow space between certainty and speculation, ancient voices continue to speak, not loudly, but persistently, asking to be taken seriously without demanding belief. As the echoes deepen, chronology begins to blur. Memory is rarely linear. especially when shaped by trauma. The Sumerian laments were written centuries after the events they describe, yet they speak with the urgency of witnesses. This temporal distance does not weaken them. It reveals how profoundly the destruction imprinted itself on cultural identity. A city can be rebuilt. A story like this cannot be undone. The laments describe a world overturned not only physically, but morally and cosmically. Order collapses. Ritual fails. Even the gods appear disoriented, abandoning sanctuaries they once inhabited. In ancient thought, such abandonment was not symbolic, it was catastrophic. A city without its gods was a body without breath. When the texts say the gods fled, they are saying something essential about the scale of the disaster. Whatever occurred made even divine presence untenable. In the Jordan Valley, the archaeological record tells a parallel story without theology. Shrines left cold, administrative buildings frozen in time, storage jars sealed with grain that would never be eaten. These are signs of sudden interruption. People did not have time to evacuate wealth or prepare for siege. Life stopped mid-gesture. The earth closed over it. Silence followed. Attempts to align the dates precisely often fail. The laments cluster around the end of the third dynasty of Ur, roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era. Tall el-Hammam's destruction layer is usually placed several centuries later. For critics, this gap ends the conversation. Different times, different places, different events. But ancient memory does not obey modern chronology. Stories persist long after calendars reset. A catastrophe remembered does not need to be recent to be vivid. It is also possible that the laments preserve a composite memory. Not a single event, but a category of destruction that recurred. Cities lost suddenly, lands poisoned, survivors displaced. Over time, these experiences may have merged into a single narrative framework, reinforced each time a new disaster echoed the old. Memory accumulates. It layers, just like sediment. This is why the physical evidence matters so much. Melted materials do not exaggerate. Salt does not mythologize. Fragmented remains do not participate in metaphor. They exist or they do not. And at Tal el-Hammam, they exist in ways that force reconsideration of what ancient people may have endured. Skeptics rightly caution against connecting distant texts to local ruins without restraint. Correlation is not causation. Similar descriptions can arise independently. Human responses to disaster are remarkably consistent across cultures. Fire from the sky, poisoned land, fleeing survivors. These are not rare motifs. They are human reactions to overwhelming loss. Yet consistency can also indicate shared experience. When multiple traditions describe the same sequence of destruction using different symbolic languages, it raises a question that cannot be dismissed easily. Did something happen in the ancient world that exceeded ordinary categories of war and weather? Something so disruptive that it entered myth, scripture, and lament alike? The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah adds another layer to this puzzle. It does not stand alone. It sits within a broader ancient Near Eastern conversation about judgment, catastrophe, and the fragility of civilization. Its imagery mirrors themes found far beyond its cultural borders. Fire descending, smoke rising like a furnace, a valley rendered uninhabitable, survivors escaping to the hills. Whether these similarities arise from direct transmission, shared environment, or coincidence remains debated. What cannot be denied is that the ancient world remembered destruction differently than we do. It did not compartmentalize disaster as purely natural or purely human. It wove meaning into memory because meaning was how survival continued. And as we move forward, deeper into texts and ruins alike, the question shifts. Not what exactly destroyed those cities, but why the memory of their destruction endured so long, pressed into clay and scripture, waiting for an age that could finally ask whether the sky itself once fell too close to home. The question of endurance is central. Civilizations forget many things. They forget kings, borders, even languages. But they do not easily forget events that rewrite the rules of survival. When catastrophe arrives without warning and without an enemy to blame, it unsettles the deepest assumptions about how the world works. The memory becomes instructional, a warning embedded in story. In the ancient Near East, cities were not merely population centers. They were cosmic anchors. Each one believed itself aligned with a divine order, protected by patron gods who ensured stability in exchange for ritual and obedience. When a city fell, that order was shaken. When multiple cities fell at once, the shock reverberated far beyond the rubble. It suggested a failure not of walls or armies, but of the very system that connected heaven and earth. This is why the laments focus so intensely on decision. The gods debate, they argue, they weigh outcomes. The destruction is framed not as accident, but as verdict. Modern readers often misinterpret this as moral allegory, but for ancient audiences, it served another function. It made the incomprehensible intelligible. If destruction had purpose, then survival had meaning. If it was decreed, then it could be remembered without madness. At Tal el-Hammam, the absence of rebuilding suggests that whatever meaning survivors attached to the event, it included fear of return. People do not abandon fertile valleys lightly. They do not leave trade routes, water access, and established infrastructure unless something convinces them the land itself has become hostile. Salt in the soil may explain agricultural failure, but not spiritual avoidance. The fear lingered longer than the chemistry. Over time, this fear would have traveled. Refugees carry stories more carefully than possessions. As populations moved north and east, as oral traditions blended and reformed, fragments of one disaster may have entered many narratives. Details shifted, locations blurred, but the core remained. Fire from above. Cities lost together. A land made barren. Survival through flight. This process does not require a single origin point. Multiple catastrophes across centuries could reinforce the same symbolic framework. Each new event would validate the old stories, lending them renewed relevance. A cosmic strike here, a volcanic eruption there, a sudden conflagration amplified by environmental conditions. Memory would weave them together, not to deceive, but to preserve. Modern archaeology often struggles with this layered memory. Excavation seeks specificity, dates, causes, mechanisms. But ancient narrative seeks continuity, meaning across time. When we demand that a text correspond to a single site or event, we may be asking the wrong question. The ancients were not writing reports. They were writing survival manuals disguised as theology. Still, the physical evidence continues to press. Melted pottery requires explanation. Fragmented remains demand accounting. These are not abstractions. They are data points that narrow the field of plausible causes. They tell us that something happened which exceeded normal Bronze Age experience. Something fast, something hot, something overwhelming. As research continues, theories will rise and fall. Airbursts will be modeled. Earthquakes reconsidered, human conflict re-examined. Some explanations will satisfy part of the evidence and fail the rest. This is the nature of deep history. It resists closure. It leaves room for uncertainty, not because answers are impossible, but because the past was more complex than our categories allow. What remains constant is the human response. Faced with forces beyond control, ancient people looked upward and inward at the same time. They encoded fear into ritual, loss into story, and catastrophe into memory. Those memories survived empires, languages, and belief systems. And now, thousands of years later, they surface again, not as warnings of divine wrath, but as invitations to humility. A reminder that civilization has always existed at the mercy of forces it does not command, and that sometimes the earth remembers what the sky once did, long after the stories fade into sleep. Humility is rarely a lesson learned voluntarily. More often, it is imposed by events that refuse negotiation. In the ancient world, this lesson arrived suddenly and without explanation. The ground burned. The air itself became an instrument of destruction. And afterward, those who remained were left to interpret ruins without guidance. In Mesopotamia, interpretation followed a familiar path. Calamity was read backward through theology. The gods must have been angered. Order must have been violated. Yet within the laments, there is an undercurrent of confusion that breaks through this certainty. The texts do not celebrate justice. They grieve loss. They do not praise divine power. They question it. Why would the gods destroy their own cities? Why abandon the people who fed and honored them? This tension is important. It suggests that the laments were not propaganda, but processing, an attempt to reconcile belief with experience. When the world no longer behaves as expected, belief systems either adapt or fracture. The laments capture that moment of strain, when explanation has not yet hardened into doctrine. At el-Hammam, no text answers back. The ruins are mute, but silence can be informative. The absence of defensive measures in the destruction layer implies that no warning preceded the event. Walls were not reinforced. Supplies were not stockpiled. There is no sign of panic-driven migration before the catastrophe. Whatever happened did not announce itself with time to prepare. This aligns uncomfortably well with descriptions of sudden descent found in ancient texts. A force arriving from above, a moment of light, a rush of wind, heat so intense that ordinary materials behave in unfamiliar ways. These are not the details of slow disasters. They are the signatures of immediacy. Modern science offers models that can produce such effects. Airbursts release immense energy in seconds. Shock waves flatten structures. Thermal radiation ignites surfaces simultaneously. Salt and debris can be lofted and redistributed across wide areas. None of this requires intent. Physics alone can account for devastation that ancient people would have found indistinguishable from divine action. Yet physics does not explain memory. It does not account for why some events become mythic while others fade. Countless earthquakes have struck the Near East. Many cities have burned. Few were remembered this way. Few inspired laments that survived for millennia, copied and recopied by scribes who found them relevant long after the original ruins had settled into dust. Perhaps what set these events apart was not only their violence, but their scale. Multiple cities affected at once, entire regions destabilized, trade disrupted, agriculture failing for generations. This kind of systemic shock threatens not just lives, but worldviews. It challenges the assumption that order is stable, that ritual ensures protection, that tomorrow will resemble today. The biblical tradition reflects a similar reckoning. The destruction of the cities of the plain is framed not as an unfortunate accident, but as a moral boundary, a line drawn in history. But beneath the theology lies the same unease, smoke rising from the valley, a landscape altered beyond recognition, a warning encoded in narrative so it would not be forgotten. Whether these traditions describe the same event or different ones shaped by similar forces remains unresolved. What is clear is that ancient people were not inventing fear. They were responding to it. Their stories are not attempts to sensationalize, but to stabilize, to make sense of a world that had proven capable of ending itself in a moment. As we continue forward, the focus shifts again, away from ruins and toward interpretation. How later generations read these memories, how modern minds project technology onto theology, and how the desire for extraordinary explanations can sometimes obscure the quiet, unsettling truth that nature alone has always been enough. Interpretation is where the past becomes most vulnerable. Once the witnesses are gone and only fragments remain, imagination begins to fill the spaces that evidence cannot. This is not deception. It is human nature. When confronted with destruction that feels disproportionate, people search for causes that feel equally vast. Over time, those causes take shape in the language and symbols of the age that remembers them. In the modern era, this search has taken on new forms. Ancient texts are reread through contemporary lenses. Words once meant to express awe or terror are recast as technical descriptions. Gods become engineers. Divine weapons become devices. Judgment becomes strategy. These interpretations often say more about modern anxieties than ancient realities, reflecting a world accustomed to technologies capable of sudden, overwhelming destruction. The most influential of these reinterpretations emerged in the late 20th century, when ancient Near Eastern texts were presented as misunderstood records of advanced intervention. According to this view, the gods of Sumer were not symbolic forces, but physical beings wielding technologies beyond Bronze Age comprehension. The laments, in this reading, were eyewitness reports encoded in religious language because no other framework existed. Mainstream scholarship has consistently rejected this approach, and not without reason. Ancient languages are subtle. Words carry ranges of meaning shaped by culture, not by future invention. To read modern concepts backward into ancient grammar risks erasing the worldview that produced the text. It replaces one form of misunderstanding with another. Yet the persistence of these theories reveals something important. People are not drawn to them because they want fantasy. They are drawn because certain details resist easy dismissal: blinding light, instantaneous destruction, landscapes rendered uninhabitable. These elements feel uncomfortably familiar in an age that has witnessed their modern equivalents. The danger lies in collapsing analogy into identity. Just because two phenomena share effects does not mean they share causes. Fire can come from lightning or from a furnace. Glass can form from impact or from industry. The ancients described what they saw, not what they measured. Their words should be respected for what they are, not forced into what we wish they meant. At el-Hammam, scientific debate continues precisely because restraint is necessary. The retraction of high-profile claims did not erase the evidence. It refined the conversation. Melted materials remain. The destruction layer remains. The abandonment remains. What changed was the certainty with which one explanation had been elevated above all others. This process is not failure. It is how understanding progresses. Each hypothesis is tested not against desire, but against data. And when data resists a single narrative, humility returns to the center. The past does not owe us clarity. It offers complexity. Ancient people lived within that complexity without the comfort of modern distance. They experienced catastrophe directly, without the buffer of explanation. Their stories are not blueprints of technology, but maps of meaning. They show how humans survive psychologically when the world proves unstable. As we move deeper into these narratives, it becomes clear that the most important question is not whether the ancients witnessed something impossible, but how they chose to remember it. Because memory determines what is passed on, and what is passed on shapes how future generations understand both danger and responsibility. The ruins remain where they are, The tablets remain silent until read. It is interpretation that moves, shifting with each age. And in that movement, we glimpse not only ancient fear, but our own reflection, searching the past for signs that catastrophe has always been part of the human story. By the time interpretation hardens into tradition, distance has already done its work. What was once immediate becomes symbolic. What was once feared becomes moralized. And what was once uncertain becomes instructive. This is how disaster survives the erosion of time, not as data, but as meaning shaped to endure. In ancient societies, meaning was not optional. It was a survival tool. Without it, trauma lingered without resolution. With it, loss could be carried forward without breaking the social fabric. The laments, the biblical narratives, the scattered ruins across the Near East all participate in this same process. They are not competing explanations. They are parallel responses. What is striking is how often these responses converge on the sky. Again and again, catastrophe is framed as descending rather than rising. Fire does not spread outward. It falls. Wind does not arrive gradually. It strikes. Light appears suddenly, overwhelming the senses. These details recur not because ancient people were obsessed with the heavens, but because the heavens were where unpredictability lived. The ground could be studied, rivers followed patterns, seasons repeated, but the sky remained unknowable. When it intervened violently, there was no precedent to consult, no ritual guaranteed to help. This made celestial disaster uniquely destabilizing. It defied preparation and punishment alike. No enemy could be blamed, no boundary defended. This is why the memory endured. A war could be explained, a famine could be anticipated, but an event that erased cities in moments, altered the land itself, and left no clear human cause demanded preservation. Not to solve it, but to remember that it could happen again. As centuries passed, these memories would migrate. Traders carried them along routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Levant. Refugees wove them into new genealogies. Priests reframed them within evolving theologies. Each retelling shifted emphasis, but the core remained intact. Fire, descent, ruin, survival through escape. Archaeology now stands at the far end of this long transmission. It does not hear stories. It uncovers consequences. Layers of ash, sudden gaps in occupation, materials altered beyond ordinary experience. These are the punctuation marks of catastrophe. They do not speak, but they insist. The tension between text and earth is not a problem to be solved. It is the space where understanding deepens. Text without evidence drifts toward myth. Evidence without context becomes meaningless. Together they suggest that ancient people were neither naive nor omniscient. They were witnesses doing their best to remember responsibly. As we move forward, the focus will widen, beyond a single city, beyond a single tradition, toward the larger pattern of collapse and renewal that has shaped human history again and again. The possibility that tall el-Hammam was not an anomaly, but one instance in a cycle older than writing. For now, let the image settle. A valley once alive, a moment of light, a rush of heat and wind, and then silence. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence that waits patiently for the next generation to ask why some stories refuse to stay buried. That refusal marks a threshold. When stories survive long after their original context dissolves, they stop belonging to one place or one people. They become signals, carried forward through time, waiting for a moment when they resonate again. This is where individual catastrophes begin to resemble patterns, and isolated ruins hint at something broader moving beneath history. Across the ancient world, the early second millennium before the Common Era was not a stable age. Trade networks stretched farther than ever before, linking city-states that depended on one another for survival. Tin from distant lands fed bronze production. Grain moved along rivers and roads. Knowledge traveled with merchants and diplomats. This interconnection created prosperity, but it also created vulnerability. A shock in one region could ripple outward, destabilizing others. When cities fell suddenly, the consequences were not contained. Refugees arrived in neighboring regions carrying stories of destruction that felt unprecedented. Markets collapsed, alliances fractured, political authority weakened. What archaeologists later describe as cultural transitions or population shifts may, in lived experience, have felt like the unraveling of a world that had seemed permanent. This is where mythology and cosmology begin to intertwine with history. Faced with instability on such a scale, ancient societies sought explanations that could encompass not just local loss, but systemic collapse. The sky, once again, offered a framework vast enough to contain the fear. Celestial order mirrored terrestrial order. When one failed, so did the other. Sumerian cosmology did not imagine the universe as distant or abstract. Heaven and earth were connected through divine hierarchy. Decisions made above had consequences below. This was not metaphorical thinking. It was structural. The same logic that governed agriculture and kingship governed the stars. Disruption in one realm implied disruption in all. Within this worldview, catastrophic events were not random. They were corrections, resets imposed when balance had been lost, floods, storms, fire from the sky. These were not punishments in the modern moral sense. They were mechanisms through which order was restored, even if restoration required destruction. This perspective appears again and again across cultures separated by geography but united by vulnerability. The idea that civilization moves in cycles, that periods of growth are followed by sudden endings, that humanity inherits not a straight line of progress, but a rhythm of ascent and collapse. Memory preserves the collapses more carefully than the ascents, because collapse teaches humility. Archaeological layers confirm this rhythm. Cities rise atop the ruins of earlier cities. Foundations are laid directly over ash. New walls incorporate melted stone from older ones. Each generation builds with the remnants of the last, often unaware of the full story beneath their feet. Tall el-Hammam fits into this larger cadence uncomfortably well. It was not merely destroyed, it was interrupted. Its absence reshaped the region for centuries. And when later populations returned, they did so with different technologies, different social structures, and different stories about the land they occupied. This suggests that whatever happened there did more than kill people. It altered trajectories. It redirected history. Such events do not remain local in memory. They echo outward, folding themselves into cosmologies that attempt to explain why cycles turn when they do. As we move deeper into this wider context, the question shifts again. Not whether a single city was destroyed by fire from the sky, but whether humanity has always lived under the shadow of forces capable of ending entire chapters of civilization without warning, and whether the ancients, in their stories and laments, were trying to ensure that this knowledge was never entirely lost. To understand why such knowledge was preserved, we have to step outside the ruins and look upward, the same direction ancient minds turned when explanations failed. The sky was not background to early civilization. It was architecture. Time itself was measured by celestial motion. Seasons, omens, kingship, and fate were all synchronized with patterns above. When something broke that pattern, it was experienced not as anomaly, but as intervention. Sumerian astronomy was not speculative in the modern sense. It was observational and cumulative. Generations of scribes recorded planetary movements, eclipses, and irregularities with obsessive care. These records were not separated from religion. They were religion. To track the sky was to monitor the intentions of the cosmos. Deviations mattered. Within this framework, a sudden, blinding event in the heavens would not be dismissed or forgotten. It would be integrated into cosmic history. If the sky delivered destruction once, it could do so again. The memory became a warning encoded in ritual and myth, ensuring that future generations remained attentive. This attentiveness is visible in the way ancient texts describe catastrophe. They do not merely recount destruction, they situate it within a cosmic sequence. A sign appears. A decision is made. A force descends. Afterward, order must be rebuilt. The structure mirrors celestial cycles of appearance, disruption, and return. The universe itself becomes a narrative actor. Modern readers often underestimate how literal this connection felt. The heavens were not distant. They were close enough to influence crops, floods, and fertility. When fire came from above, it did not feel symbolic. It felt direct, personal. The sky had acted. This worldview also shaped how ancient societies understood responsibility. If catastrophe was cosmic, then prevention was not about fortifications or weapons, but alignment, proper ritual, moral balance, correct timing. These were tools believed capable of influencing outcomes beyond human strength. When they failed, the failure was existential. At el-Hammam, the absence of reconstruction may reflect more than environmental damage. It may reflect perceived cosmic contamination. A place where heaven had acted violently could be seen as permanently altered, unsuitable for ordinary human habitation. Such sites often became taboo, remembered but avoided. This pattern appears elsewhere. Cities destroyed suddenly are sometimes left untouched for generations, even when practical reasons to rebuild exist. Memory, not material scarcity, keeps people away. The land becomes a marker of what happens when balance is lost. Over time, these markers accumulate. They form a mental map of danger zones, both geographic and symbolic. The world is no longer neutral. Certain places, certain times, certain alignments are remembered as thresholds. Cross them carelessly, and catastrophe returns. As our story continues, this cosmic perspective becomes essential, not because it explains what happened in modern terms, but because it explains how ancient people lived with the knowledge that something beyond their control had once erased everything they trusted, and how they carried that knowledge forward, quietly, patiently, waiting for an age that would finally listen, without dismissing their fear as fiction. Listening without dismissal requires restraint. It asks us to resist the impulse to convert ancient fear into modern spectacle, or ancient language into modern certainty. The people who recorded these events were not trying to impress the future. They were trying to survive the present. Their words were shaped by urgency, not legacy. In the centuries following widespread collapse, cultures across the Near East reorganized themselves around memory. New dynasties rose, claiming divine favor precisely because the old ones had lost it. Law codes became more rigid, ritual calendars more elaborate. The trauma of sudden loss hardened into systems designed to prevent its return. Civilization did not simply rebuild. It armored itself psychologically. This is visible in how later texts reinterpret earlier disasters. Flood narratives expand. Fire becomes purifying as well as destructive. Judgment is framed as necessary rather than arbitrary. These shifts do not erase fear. They domesticate it. They turn chaos into cautionary order. Yet beneath these refinements, the older unease remains detectable. A recognition that alignment is never guaranteed, that the sky cannot be negotiated with indefinitely, that prosperity may be provisional. This awareness does not disappear with technological advancement. It retreats into myth, resurfacing whenever the world reminds humanity of its limits. In this sense, ancient laments are not relics. They are mirrors. They reflect a psychological response that reappears whenever catastrophe overwhelms explanation. Modern language may change, but the structure remains. Shock, search for cause, moral reckoning, story. What makes Tall el-Hammam compelling is not that it proves any single narrative correct, but that it reopens a conversation long assumed closed. For generations, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was treated purely as theology, a lesson, not an event. The ruins challenge that separation. They suggest that theology may have grown from experience rather than replacing it. This does not validate every interpretation layered onto the past. It does not require belief in lost technologies or divine weapons. It requires only acknowledgement that ancient people recorded what they experienced as faithfully as they could, using the tools available to them. When those records align uncomfortably well with physical evidence, curiosity becomes responsibility. Responsibility to ask carefully, to distinguish between evidence and desire, to allow uncertainty to remain where certainty cannot be earned. The past deserves that respect. As night deepens and attention drifts, the outlines of this story soften. What remains is not a conclusion, but a posture, an awareness that history is not a straight line, but a series of thresholds. Moments when everything changes, and those who live through it must decide how to remember. The ancients chose to remember in clay, in scripture, in ritual. They left behind not answers, but warnings shaped like stories. And those stories, patient and unassuming, continue to wait for listeners willing to hear them not as myth, but as echoes of a world that learned too suddenly how fragile it truly was. Echoes do not demand attention. They persist quietly, repeating themselves until someone notices the pattern. In the ancient world, these echoes accumulated slowly, crossing generations that no longer remembered the original event, only its residue. A ruined city avoided, a valley spoken of in lowered voices, a ritual added, not fully understood, but never omitted. Over time, these practices solidified into tradition. What began as fear became custom. What began as memory became law. In this way, catastrophe reshaped civilization without announcing itself. The visible damage faded, but the behavioral changes endured. This is how destruction outlives debris. In Mesopotamia, the legacy of earlier collapses can be seen in the increasing preoccupation with omens and divination. Celestial observation became not just scholarly, but urgent. Irregularities in the sky were recorded with heightened anxiety. Eclipses were no longer curiosities, they were warnings. The heavens were watched not for beauty, but for signs of disruption. This vigilance suggests that the past had taught a lesson too severe to forget. Something had arrived without warning once before. Something that had not respected walls, armies, or prayers. The response was not confidence, but caution. If catastrophe could descend from above, then the sky had to be monitored relentlessly. At the same time, memory became selective. Details blurred. Specific locations dissolved into archetypes. A destroyed city became any city. A cursed valley became any place where order failed. This abstraction allowed the lesson to travel farther than the event itself. It could be applied anywhere, anytime. The biblical tradition reflects this same process. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah does not linger on architecture or trade routes. It focuses on moral atmosphere. The city becomes an idea, not a map coordinate. This does not negate the possibility of a real location. It demonstrates how memory adapts to remain relevant. When archaeology later uncovers physical remains that resemble the narrative's consequences, the connection feels unsettling because it reverses the usual flow. Story is supposed to grow from evidence. Here, evidence seems to catch up to story centuries later, as if the ground itself is confirming that memory was not invented. This reversal challenges modern assumptions. It suggests that ancient people may have been more accurate witnesses than we expect, even if their explanations differ from ours. They described effects faithfully, even when causes eluded them. Fire fell. The land failed. Life stopped. These are not metaphors. They are observations. Still, restraint remains essential. The temptation to unify all catastrophe into a single grand explanation is strong. Patterns invite synthesis. But history resists simplicity. Multiple events can produce similar scars. Different causes can leave overlapping signatures. The task is not to collapse everything into one answer, but to recognize recurrence without erasing difference. What emerges instead is a worldview shaped by interruption. Civilization is not assumed to be permanent. It is conditional, subject to forces that operate on timescales beyond human planning. This awareness does not paralyze ancient cultures. It motivates them. They build, but they remember. They prosper, but they watch the sky. As this awareness settles in, the story widens further, beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the Levant, toward other cultures that preserved memories of sudden endings, other valleys where cities vanished, other myths that speak of fire, wind, and silence, not because they all describe the same moment, but because they all respond to the same realization, that the world can change faster than language can explain. And that survival depends not only on rebuilding what was lost, but on remembering why it was lost in the first place. When the horizon expands, similarities begin to surface that are difficult to ignore. Across continents and millennia, human cultures preserved stories of sudden devastation that arrived from beyond the familiar rhythms of nature. These stories are not identical, but they rhyme. Fire from the sky, winds that flatten cities, days that turn unnaturally bright. Lands rendered sterile long after the event itself has passed. This does not require a single global catastrophe. It suggests something more subtle and more unsettling, that the ancient world encountered extreme events often enough for memory to adapt around them. That rare disasters were not singular anomalies, but part of a broader environmental reality humanity learned to fear, even if it could not predict. In regions shaped by tectonics, volcanoes left lasting impressions. In floodplains, rivers erased cities overnight. In arid zones, drought collapsed kingdoms silently. But events involving the sky carried a different weight. They were sudden, directionless, unarguable. No border stopped them. No preparation softened their arrival. They appeared, acted, and vanished, leaving interpretation to the survivors. This may explain why celestial catastrophe occupies such a privileged place in myth. It was the one category of destruction that resisted human agency entirely. You could not negotiate with it. You could only endure it, remember it, and hope memory itself would function as defense. In this light, the Sumerian laments and the biblical account of the cities of the plain become less isolated. They join a wider human archive of sky-born fear. Each culture recorded what it knew, filtered through its cosmology, geography, and moral framework. The core experience remained the same. Sudden loss, overwhelming force, aftermath that lingered longer than ruins. Archaeology occasionally stumbles upon sites that echo this pattern. Cities destroyed without signs of siege. Regions abandoned despite strategic value. Materials altered in ways that suggest exposure to extreme energy. Each discovery reopens the question: was this war? Was it accident? Or was it something else entirely? Science offers tools that ancient people lacked, but it does not erase uncertainty. It narrows possibilities. It tests hypotheses. It rules out what cannot be supported. In doing so, it sometimes reveals how fragile our assumptions about stability truly are. Events capable of overwhelming civilizations do not require intent. They require only timing. The sky remains indifferent to human order. Objects cross Earth's path constantly. Most pass unnoticed. Some burn harmlessly. A few arrive at precisely the wrong moment. Modern instruments track many of them now, but not all. The ancient world had no such warning, only aftermath. This awareness reframes ancient fear as realism rather than superstition. They did not imagine danger where none existed. They remembered danger where it had already struck. Their stories were not forecasts. They were scars. As night settles deeper and attention softens, this perspective invites a quieter reflection. Civilization has always existed within a narrow margin of tolerance. Prosperity depends on long stretches of calm. Memory survives because calm does not, and so the ancient voices remain, speaking not of certainty, but of caution, not of dominance, but of humility. They do not tell us what destroyed their cities with precision. They tell us something more enduring, that once, without warning, the sky came too close. That closeness left an imprint not only on memory, but on imagination. Once the sky had demonstrated its capacity for destruction, it could never return to being merely decorative. Stars were no longer just markers of time. They were reminders of vulnerability. Every unusual light, every unexpected sound from above carried the weight of what had already happened once. In many ancient traditions, this awareness shaped how time itself was understood. History was not linear progress. It was cyclical tension. Ages rose and fell. Orders were established, disrupted, and restored. The present was never isolated from the past. It sat within a repeating pattern whose turning points were marked by catastrophe. This cyclical worldview did not emerge from abstraction. It was reinforced by lived experience. Cities that thrived for centuries could vanish in a generation. Fields that fed thousands could fail for lifetimes. These were not theoretical possibilities. They had already occurred. Memory ensured they were not dismissed as impossible. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods themselves were subject to cycles. Assemblies convened. Decisions reversed. Favor shifted. This fluidity mirrored the instability of the world below. If even divine order could change, then human order was never secure. The laments reflect this anxiety clearly. They do not celebrate permanence. They mourn its illusion. The biblical tradition echoes this rhythm in its own way. Destruction is followed by exile, exile by return, judgment by renewal. The land itself participates in these cycles, alternating between abundance and barrenness. What matters is not avoiding collapse forever, but surviving it with memory intact. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. Many regions show repeated occupation layers separated by abrupt destruction horizons. Each horizon marks a moment when continuity broke. Each rebuilding represents adaptation rather than recovery. The new city is never identical to the old one. It carries the lessons of loss in its design, its rituals, its laws. Tall el-Hammam, however, interrupts even this pattern. Its absence stretches unusually long. The valley does not simply pause, it empties. This suggests that the lesson learned there was severe enough to discourage return. The land itself became a warning. Warnings like this travel beyond geography. They enter language. They shape metaphors. Fire from heaven becomes shorthand for ultimate consequence. Salted land becomes a symbol of finality. These images persist because they were once real enough to fear. Over time, the original event recedes, but the emotional residue remains potent. Later generations inherit caution without context. They obey rituals whose origins are forgotten. They repeat stories whose edges have softened, yet the core persists. waiting for moments when evidence resurfaces and memory sharpens again. As we continue forward, the narrative will turn toward those moments. Times when archaeology, geology, and text intersect just closely enough to disturb comfortable separation between myth and history. Moments when the ancient insistence that catastrophe could arrive from above no longer feels symbolic but observational. For now, let the cycle settle into awareness. Rise, collapse, memory, renewal. A rhythm older than writing, traced in ruins and retold in stories, reminding us that what endures is not certainty, but the quiet vigilance born from having once watched the sky betray the ground beneath our feet. Vigilance, once learned, does not disappear. It changes shape. In ancient societies, it became ritualized, embedded into calendars, festivals, and prohibitions that governed daily life. Certain days were considered dangerous. Certain signs required immediate response. These practices were not arbitrary. They were cultural reflexes formed in response to remembered rupture. The sky remained central to this vigilance, not as an object of worship alone, but as a source of uncertainty that demanded respect. Sudden lights, unusual clouds, trembling air. These were not ignored. They were logged, debated, interpreted. The heavens were treated as a text that could be read, even if its meaning was never fully understood. This attitude contrasts sharply with modern assumptions about ancient fatalism. Far from passive, these societies were actively attentive. They could not prevent catastrophe, but they believed awareness mattered. To be surprised once was tragedy. To be surprised twice was failure of memory. Within this framework, the laments serve a crucial function. They are not just expressions of grief. They are instructional records. They teach future generations what devastation feels like, how quickly order can collapse, and how long recovery can take. They encode caution in narrative form, ensuring it survives even when specific details fade. Tall el-Hammam fits this logic unsettlingly well. The scale of abandonment suggests that memory of the event discouraged return long after environmental conditions might have allowed it. People remembered not only that the city fell, but how it fell. The manner of destruction mattered as much as the outcome. In later traditions, this distinction persists. Cities destroyed by human enemies can be reclaimed. Cities destroyed by the sky often cannot. The difference is not physical alone, it is psychological. One implies defeat, the other implies transgression against forces beyond negotiation. This may explain why the biblical narrative emphasizes the direction of destruction. Fire comes down, smoke rises. Observers watch from a distance, powerless. The framing reinforces helplessness. The event cannot be resisted or redirected. It must be endured or escaped. Such framing does not require literal divine intent to function. It reflects how overwhelming events are experienced by those within them. Modern disaster survivors describe similar sensations. Time slows. Sound distorts. Meaning collapses. Later, memory reorganizes itself around images rather than sequences. Ancient texts preserve this image-based memory. They do not reconstruct events step by step. They present impressions: heat, light, wind, silence. These impressions recur because they were what survived the moment. They are the raw materials of trauma. As archaeology brings these impressions into dialogue with physical evidence, a deeper picture emerges. Not one of advanced technology or lost science, but of human perception at the edge of comprehension. The ancients were not trying to explain the universe. They were trying to survive knowing it could turn hostile without warning. This realization reframes the entire discussion. The question is no longer whether ancient accounts are scientifically precise. It is whether they are psychologically accurate, whether they capture what it feels like when the ground no longer feels permanent and the sky becomes a source of fear. In that sense, the laments succeed completely. They carry forward the emotional truth of catastrophe, stripped of technical detail but rich in warning. And as we move deeper into this story, that warning grows quieter, not weaker. A reminder that memory, when preserved carefully, can outlast ruins, empires, and even certainty itself. Quiet warnings are the ones that endure longest. They do not demand action. They wait. In the ancient world, waiting was a form of wisdom. Civilizations learned that the forces capable of ending them operated on timescales far longer than a single lifetime. What mattered was not prediction, but remembrance. This is why ancient cultures invested so much effort in continuity. Scribes copied texts long after their original relevance seemed to fade. Priests repeated rituals whose origins were no longer questioned. Elders told stories that no longer aligned neatly with the present landscape. These practices were not nostalgia. They were insurance against forgetting. In Mesopotamia, this continuity was explicit. City laments were preserved even after the cities themselves no longer existed. Their names became symbols of vulnerability rather than power. To speak them was to acknowledge that greatness did not guarantee survival. Memory became a stabilizing force, anchoring identity in awareness rather than confidence. The same dynamic appears in the biblical tradition. The destruction of cities is not erased as an embarrassment. It is repeated, studied, and integrated into moral teaching. The story persists because it communicates a boundary, a reminder that prosperity without restraint invites consequences beyond human control. Archaeology confirms that ancient people did not simply abandon dangerous places, they reclassified them. Certain ruins became landmarks of warning. Travelers passed them with caution. Oral traditions marked them as places where something had gone wrong in a way that could not be repaired. Tall el-Hammam occupies this category uneasily. Its scale and location should have guaranteed reoccupation. Instead, it became a void. For centuries, life avoided it. This suggests that whatever memory survived, the destruction was powerful enough to override economic logic. Fear outweighed necessity. Modern excavation re-enters this space without inherited fear. Scientists approach with tools, not taboos. Yet the evidence they uncover recreates unease through different means. Melted materials, fragmented remains, a horizon of ash that refuses to fit comfortably into known patterns. This convergence between ancient caution and modern confusion is telling. It suggests that the original response to the event may not have been irrational. It may have been informed by direct experience of something that resisted assimilation into ordinary understanding. As we move forward, the narrative will begin to examine how later generations attempted to reinterpret these warnings, how philosophy, theology, and eventually science each tried to tame the memory of catastrophe by categorizing it, and how each framework, in its own way, struggled with the same fundamental discomfort. For now, the story pauses in this space of continuity, between fear and knowledge, between memory and evidence, a place where the ancients chose to remember quietly, trusting that someday someone would uncover the ground again and realize that the silence had always been saying something important. That realization arrives slowly. It does not announce itself as discovery. It settles in as discomfort. A sense that the evidence does not simply point backward but outward, toward a broader condition humanity has always lived within. The ancients did not preserve memory because they enjoyed dwelling on ruin. They preserved it because forgetting felt dangerous. As later civilizations emerged, they inherited landscapes already shaped by catastrophe, rivers rerouted, cities buried, valleys avoided. These features were not neutral geography, they were historical residues. Even when the original cause was forgotten, the effects remained visible enough to influence settlement and belief. Philosophers would later attempt to rationalize this inheritance. They spoke of natural order, of balance, of causes that could be understood and therefore mitigated. This impulse was not wrong, it was necessary. But it was also incomplete, because not all forces that shape history operate on scales that allow for mastery. The ancients understood this intuitively. Their cosmologies included chaos not as an anomaly, but as a permanent presence held at bay only temporarily. Order was achieved, not assumed. It required maintenance, ritual, attention, memory. When order failed, it was not because it had been poorly designed, but because it had always been provisional. This understanding is embedded deeply in the laments. They do not describe a world malfunctioning. They describe a world behaving as it sometimes does, overwhelming, indifferent, capable of erasing complexity in moments. The tragedy is not that destruction occurred, but that it reminded humanity of something it would rather forget. Modern perspectives often frame ancient thought as pessimistic or fatalistic, but this misreads the intent. To acknowledge vulnerability is not to surrender. It is to remain alert. The laments are acts of resilience. They say, this happened, and we are still here to remember it. At Tal el-Hammam, that resilience is harder to see because the city did not recover. Yet even absence can be instructive. The long gap in occupation speaks to a decision made collectively, reinforced over generations. A decision to stay away, to let memory outweigh ambition. In time, new peoples arrived who did not share the same fear. They saw fertile land and strategic position. They did not inherit the story in its full intensity. Memory had thinned enough to allow return. This pattern repeats throughout history. Distance dulls warning. Prosperity rebuilds confidence. The cycle begins again. What archaeology does, unintentionally, is restore some of that lost intensity. By uncovering physical traces that align with ancient fear, it sharpens memory once more. It reminds us that caution was not born from imagination alone. It was earned. As this chapter of the story closes, the narrative prepares to shift again, away from the ancient world and toward interpretation across ages. How medieval thinkers, early modern scholars, and contemporary researchers each grappled with the same fragments, reshaping them according to the needs and fears of their own time. Because memory does not remain static, it adapts. It survives by changing form, and in every age it asks the same quiet question, not what destroyed the city, but whether we are willing to remember that it was ever destroyed at all. When memory passes from one age to another, it rarely remains intact. Each era inherits fragments and fills the gaps with its own assumptions. Medieval scholars read ancient destruction through theology. Early modern thinkers filtered it through emerging natural philosophy. Contemporary researchers approach it with instruments and models. Each layer adds clarity in one direction and distortion in another. In medieval thought, catastrophe was moralized almost completely. Destruction confirmed divine authority. Cities fell because they deserved to fall. This interpretation offered comfort. It placed chaos within a moral framework that preserved meaning. But it also simplified memory, stripping away uncertainty in favor of certainty that felt safer. As scientific thinking emerged, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. Divine causation was dismissed. Natural mechanisms took its place. Floods, earthquakes, fires. Events once feared as cosmic interventions were reclassified as environmental hazards. This shift brought immense progress, but it also introduced a new blindness. The assumption that once classified, A phenomenon was fully understood. Some ancient memories resisted this transition. They did not fit neatly into known categories. Their effects were too sudden, too concentrated, too extreme. Rather than forcing these anomalies into existing models, many scholars chose to ignore them. What could not be explained comfortably was treated as exaggeration or fiction. Tall el-Hammam disrupted this comfort. The site refused to conform. It presented evidence that overlapped categories without settling into one. Heat without prolonged fire, destruction without siege, abandonment without obvious economic cause. Each explanation worked partially and failed completely. This discomfort mirrors what ancient people must have felt in the aftermath. The sense that familiar frameworks were insufficient. That something had occurred which could not be domesticated by explanation. In this way, modern scholarship finds itself unexpectedly aligned with ancient experience. Both stand before evidence that resists closure. The temptation in such moments is polarization. Either the event must be mundane and fully explainable, or it must be extraordinary and paradigm-shattering. But history rarely operates at extremes. It unfolds in liminal spaces where causes overlap and consequences exceed intention. As debates continue, the most valuable outcome may not be consensus, but humility. A recognition that the ancient world was exposed to forces we still struggled to predict, and that memory of those exposures shaped culture in ways that persist beneath the surface of modern thought. The story now turns toward those forces themselves, not in pursuit of a final answer, but to understand the range of possibilities ancient people faced. Natural, cosmic, environmental. The sky that inspired awe also carried risk, and long before humanity could name that risk, it learned to fear it, remember it, and encode that memory into stories that refused to disappear. Risk, in the ancient imagination, was never abstract. It was experiential. It arrived without consultation and left consequences that could not be argued away. When the sky became a source of danger, it did not do so as an idea. It did so as heat on skin, pressure in the lungs, light so intense it erased shadows. These sensations were remembered long after their cause vanished from sight. Modern science gives names to some of these possibilities. Asteroids, comets, air bursts, objects moving at velocities that compress time itself, releasing energies that dwarf human invention. Most of these events occur unnoticed, burning high above the planet or striking oceans and empty land. But occasionally, by alignment alone, they intersect with civilization. The ancient world had no way to calculate probability, only outcome. When something like this happened, it felt singular, intentional, almost personal, not because it was directed, but because its impact was total. It did not negotiate with belief. It overwhelmed it. This helps explain why ancient texts focus so intensely on the moment of arrival rather than the mechanics behind it. They describe what could be seen and felt. Light before sound, wind after heat, structures collapsing inward rather than outward. These details matter because they were how the event entered human awareness. At Tall el-Hammam, the physical record preserves this sequence imperfectly but suggestively. The pattern of destruction indicates rapid energy release rather than prolonged assault. Materials were altered before they could burn conventionally. Bodies were disrupted before they could flee. These are not signatures of gradual failure. They are signatures of interruption. Whether this interruption came from above, below, or within the city itself remains debated. What matters for memory is not the vector, but the speed. Events that unfold slowly allow for adaptation. Events that unfold in seconds do not. They carve themselves into culture because there is no time to soften their meaning. The laments capture this lack of time. They speak of people caught where they stood. of animals perishing alongside humans, of silence following noise. These are not literary flourishes. They are the structure of shock. Modern disaster psychology confirms this pattern. Survivors of sudden catastrophes often remember fragments rather than narratives, sensations rather than sequences, light, sound, disorientation. Later, the mind assembles these fragments into story because story is how coherence returns. Ancient storytellers did the same, guided by cosmology rather than neurology. They placed the fragments into a framework that made sense to them. Gods decided, forces descended, order was disrupted and would one day be restored. This did not explain the event scientifically, but it allowed life to continue afterward. As we move deeper into this possibility space, it becomes clear that the question of ancient nuclear war misses the point. The ancients were not describing technology. They were describing impact. They were recording what it felt like when energy beyond comprehension intersected with human settlement. The distinction matters, because it allows us to respect the testimony without distorting it, to acknowledge that ancient people may have witnessed phenomena rare enough to feel supernatural, without assuming they misunderstood their own world entirely. The sky has always been capable of surprise. That capability did not begin with modern weapons. It predates humanity itself. The ancient world learned this lesson the hard way, and it chose to remember, not with equations, but with stories shaped to endure when explanation failed. In the next movement of this narrative, we will examine how often such lessons were learned, forgotten, and learned again. How cycles of catastrophe intersect with cycles of civilization, and how memory itself may be the most fragile and most essential inheritance humanity carries forward into the dark. Memory, when carried across centuries, does not remain sharp. It softens at the edges, losing precision, but gaining reach. What is remembered less clearly is often remembered more widely. This is how catastrophe becomes cycle rather than incident. Not a single story, but a recurring shape recognized whenever conditions align again. Archaeology reveals these shapes scattered across time. Periods when multiple regions experience disruption within a narrow window. Trade routes collapse. Populations shift. Cities are abandoned almost simultaneously despite vast distances between them. Each episode invites explanation. Climate change, volcanic activity, disease. In some cases, evidence supports these causes. In others, the picture remains incomplete. The ancient world did not separate these forces. To them, a flood, a storm, and a falling star belonged to the same category. They were acts of the world asserting itself. What mattered was not classification, but consequence. Lives lost, landscapes altered, memory rewritten. Tall el-Hammam sits within one of these broader moments of disruption. Its destruction coincides with regional instability that affected multiple settlements across the Jordan Valley. Whether this instability was triggered by a single event or a cascade of pressures remains debated. What is clear is that the outcome was disproportionate. A thriving urban center vanished, and its absence reshaped the region for generations. When such absences accumulate across history, they suggest rhythm rather than randomness. Not a predictable cycle, but a recurring vulnerability. Civilization expands during long periods of relative calm. It contracts sharply when that calm is interrupted. Memory preserves the contractions more faithfully than the expansions because they hurt more. Ancient texts reflect this awareness. They speak of ages ending abruptly, of golden times followed by darkness, of knowledge lost and later rediscovered. These are not fantasies of decline. They are observations stretched across generations. Modern narratives of progress often resist this idea. They prefer linear ascent. Each collapse becomes an exception, a failure of governance or morality. But the archaeological record does not support a smooth curve. It supports a jagged one. Peaks followed by sudden drops. Recovery followed by new vulnerability. This does not diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that civilization has always existed in negotiation with forces it does not control. Technology changes the terms of that negotiation, but not its existence. As this section closes, the focus prepares to shift again, away from cycles as abstract patterns and toward the human cost embedded within them. How individuals experience these endings, how families survived them, and how the quiet act of remembering became the bridge between one world and the next. Because beneath every collapsed city lies not just debris, but interrupted lives, and it is their need to make sense of sudden loss that shape the stories we still read, the ruins we still excavate, and the unease that still rises when we imagine the sky doing more than simply passing overhead. Interrupted lives rarely leave clear records. They vanish between layers, absorbed into ash and soil. Archaeology recovers their homes, their tools, their food stores, but almost never their final thoughts. To understand catastrophe at a human scale, we must listen for what is implied rather than stated. Silence becomes evidence. Absence becomes testimony. In the ruins of abruptly destroyed cities, daily life is frozen in fragments, meals unfinished, doors left open, objects dropped where they were last held. These details speak quietly of surprise, of moments that ended before fear could fully form. Catastrophe in these cases was not anticipated. It was encountered. This is what distinguishes traumatic endings from gradual decline. Slow collapse allows adaptation. People leave. They reorganize. They remember loss but not shock. Sudden destruction leaves no such margin. It fractures time itself. Before and after no longer connect smoothly. Something snaps. Ancient narratives preserve this rupture more faithfully than dates or diagrams ever could. They describe confusion rather than strategy, flight rather than resistance. Survivors do not speak of heroism. They speak of escape, of looking back, of smoke where streets once were. These are the memories that survive because they are burned in. The biblical image of a figure fleeing a burning valley while forbidden to look back captures this psychology perfectly. It is not about disobedience. It is about trauma, the instinct to turn toward what is being lost, even when doing so is dangerous. The past pulling at the survivor with unbearable force. Sumerian laments echo this same tension. They describe people wandering without destination, temples empty, songs unfinished. The social fabric does not tear slowly, it dissolves. Relationships that defined identity vanish along with place. The individual becomes unmoored. At Tal el-Hammam, the human cost is inferred through what is missing. No mass graves prepared in advance. No signs of organized evacuation. The destruction layer suggests people were present in ordinary numbers when everything ended. Families, not armies. Civilians, not combatants. This matters. It reframes the event away from conflict and toward catastrophe. Warfare targets people. Catastrophe engulfs them. The difference is not semantic. It is experiential. Survivors of war understand enemy intent. Survivors of catastrophe confront randomness. That confrontation changes how memory forms. Randomness is intolerable to the human mind. It demands interpretation. This is why ancient people framed catastrophe as decision. Not because they believed the universe was cruel, but because meaning was necessary for survival. If something happened for a reason, then the world remained intelligible, even if that reason was terrible. Modern frameworks often resist this need. They prefer explanation without meaning, cause without purpose. But ancient narratives remind us that meaning itself is adaptive. It allows communities to rebuild identity after identity has been stripped away. As we cross this threshold in the story, the scale shifts again. From individual shock to collective response. From the moment of destruction to the long process of living afterward. How societies reorganize when their assumptions have been proven fragile. How they decide what must never be forgotten. Because the true legacy of catastrophe is not the moment it occurs, but what it teaches those who live long enough to remember it. Living afterward is rarely heroic. It is practical, quiet, and heavy with compromise. Survivors do not rebuild the world they lost. They assemble something smaller, shaped by caution and restraint. The memory of sudden destruction narrows ambition. It changes priorities. Security replaces expansion. Stability replaces grandeur. In ancient societies, this shift is visible in architecture and law. Fortifications grow thicker. Settlements move to higher ground. Codes become stricter. Ritual observance intensifies. These are not signs of superstition. They are adaptive behaviors shaped by fear that has proven justified. The trauma of sudden catastrophe also alters how communities relate to one another. Trust contracts. Outsiders are viewed with suspicion. Alliances are fragile. When survival has been threatened by forces beyond negotiation, control becomes precious. Anything unpredictable is dangerous. This psychological tightening leaves traces in text. Later generations describe the past as morally unstable, chaotic, in need of correction. Stories of destruction become warnings about excess, corruption, or imbalance. The original event fades, replaced by lessons extracted from its shadow. This is how history becomes didactic. Catastrophe is no longer just remembered, it is used. It becomes a tool for shaping behavior. A reminder that prosperity can vanish if order is neglected. Whether the order in question is moral, cosmic, or social depends on the culture doing the remembering. Yet beneath these moral layers, the original fear remains discernible. The fear of speed, the fear of no warning, the fear that even correct behavior does not guarantee safety. These fears are harder to integrate, so they persist as unease rather than doctrine. Tall el-Hammam embodies this unease archaeologically. The site does not show signs of moral reform or political reorganization afterward because there was no afterward there. The response occurred elsewhere, among those who fled. The land itself was left to hold the memory alone. Elsewhere, this memory diffused into neighboring cultures. It blended with other disasters. It became less specific, but more durable. The details changed, but the structure remained. A city falls suddenly. Survivors escape. The land becomes altered. The story endures. As centuries pass, these stories begin to overlap. Flood narratives intersect with fire narratives. Earth and sky blend. The distinction between different types of catastrophe blurs because what mattered was not the cause, but the lesson. That permanence is an illusion. Modern archaeology attempts to reverse this process, to separate layers, to isolate causes, to reconstruct sequence. This effort is valuable, but it must contend with the fact that memory does not organize itself the same way evidence does. What is meaningful to people is not always what is measurable. As this narrative continues, the focus will turn toward this tension between memory and measurement, between lived experience and reconstructed explanation, and how both are necessary even when they refuse to align perfectly, because the past does not survive as a single truth. It survives as a conversation between what happened and what was remembered, and sometimes the space between those two carries the most important warning of all. That warning lives in the gap between certainty and experience. It is the space where numbers fail to convey fear, and where stories preserve what data cannot. Ancient people understood this intuitively. They did not separate knowledge into disciplines. Memory, ritual, observation, and meaning were intertwined because survival required all of them at once. When catastrophe struck, the first task was not explanation, it was orientation. Who was alive? Where to go? What remained safe? Only later did interpretation emerge, shaped by distance and reflection. By then, the rawness of experience had already been softened into narrative. This process explains why ancient accounts often feel ambiguous to modern readers. They were not designed to satisfy future curiosity. They were designed to stabilize the present. Precision was less important than coherence. A story that held a community together mattered more than a mechanism that could not be acted upon. At Tal el-Hammam, this distinction is stark. Archaeology can tell us how hot it became, how quickly structures failed, how long the land remained abandoned. It cannot tell us what survivors felt as they fled, or how they explained the event to their children. That explanation survives only indirectly, scattered through later traditions. The same pattern appears in the Sumerian laments. They are not forensic reports. They are emotional maps. They trace loss through metaphor, not measurement. This does not make them unreliable. It makes them human. Modern scholarship sometimes struggles with this humanity. There is a tendency to privilege what can be quantified and dismiss what cannot. Yet history is lived, not measured. Its deepest impacts occur at the level of perception, belief, and behavior. These leave traces that are harder to excavate, but no less real. The danger arises when either side is allowed to dominate completely. When memory is taken as literal mechanism, speculation outruns evidence. When measurement dismisses memory, meaning evaporates. The past becomes sterile. Neither approach honors the complexity of lived experience. The story of sudden destruction in the ancient Near East sits precisely at this intersection. It demands that we listen to both ground and text without forcing them into agreement. The ruins speak of heat, force, and absence. The stories speak of fear, judgment, and survival. Together they describe a reality that neither could convey alone. As we move forward, this balance becomes increasingly important. The temptation to resolve ambiguity grows stronger the longer uncertainty persists. But some histories resist resolution because resolution was never part of their function. They were meant to endure, not conclude. The ancients did not ask whether catastrophe would happen again. They assumed it might. Their concern was readiness, not prediction. Memory was their early warning system. Stories were their sensors. In the next phase of this narrative, we will explore how this ancient strategy echoes into the present, how modern civilization, for all its technology, still relies on memory to navigate uncertainty, and how the quiet persistence of these ancient warnings may be more relevant now than at any point since they were first pressed into clay. Relevance shifts with time, but vulnerability does not. Modern civilization often assumes distance from ancient fears, protected by technology, prediction, and control. Yet beneath this confidence lies the same exposure that shaped early memory. The planet has not changed its position in space. The sky still moves as it always has. What has changed is our relationship to uncertainty. Ancient people accepted uncertainty as permanent. Their systems were built around accommodation rather than mastery. Modern societies, by contrast, are built on optimization. Efficiency replaces redundancy. Precision replaces margin. These choices bring prosperity, but they also narrow tolerance for disruption. When systems fail, they fail quickly. This makes ancient memory unexpectedly instructive, not because it offers technical solutions, but because it models psychological preparedness, the willingness to expect interruption, to encode caution into culture, to remember that stability is conditional. The laments and disaster narratives of the ancient world functioned as reminders embedded deep within collective identity. They did not sit at the margins. They were recited, copied, ritualized. Their purpose was not fear-mongering. It was orientation, to ensure that success never erased awareness of fragility. In the modern era, such reminders often feel unwelcome. Progress narratives dominate. Collapse is framed as anomaly. When warnings surface, they are frequently minimized, postponed, or reframed as distant threats. The assumption is that technology will intervene before memory is required. Yet technology itself is part of the cycle. It accelerates growth and concentrates vulnerability. Complex systems depend on stability at every level. Disruption at one point cascades rapidly. This is not speculation. It is observable across infrastructure, economics, and climate. The ancient world experienced this on a smaller scale, but the principle was the same. Interconnected cities prospered together and collapsed together. Trade routes amplified abundance and risk simultaneously. When catastrophe struck one node, the effects radiated outward. Tall el-Hammam illustrates this dynamic in early form. Its destruction affected not just its inhabitants, but the entire regional network. Settlements emptied, trade faltered, memory spread faster than people. The absence became a signal. In our time, signals travel instantly, but speed does not guarantee comprehension. Information overwhelms, memory fragments. Without narrative, warning dissolves into noise. This is where ancient strategy becomes relevant again. Not the specifics of their explanations, but the discipline of remembering. As this narrative approaches its final movement, the focus turns inward, toward the role of inheritance. How each generation receives not only land and language, but memory shaped by catastrophe, and how the choice to remember or forget influences what comes next. Because the ancients did not preserve their stories so that future civilizations could admire them. They preserved them so that future civilizations might pause when confidence grows too absolute, might listen when the sky seems too quiet, might recognize that some warnings arrive long before danger does. The ruins remain. The texts endure. Not as proof of any single theory, but as reminders that history's most important lessons often arrive disguised as stories we think we have outgrown. Inheritance is rarely chosen. It arrives quietly, embedded in language, custom, and assumption. Long before individuals decide what to believe, they absorb what their culture remembers. This is how ancient catastrophe extends its influence far beyond those who witnessed it directly. Memory becomes environment. In societies shaped by sudden destruction, caution often masquerades as tradition. Rules persist long after their original cause is forgotten. Certain places remain avoided. Certain actions remain taboo. The explanation fades, but the behavior endures. This is not superstition. It is memory operating beneath awareness. Archaeological landscapes reflect this process. Some ruins are not dismantled for stone. Some fertile valleys remain sparsely occupied despite apparent advantage. These patterns are difficult to explain through economics alone. They suggest inherited hesitation, a sense that some places are better left untouched. Tall el-Hammam may have functioned this way for centuries. Its ruins stood as a visible reminder of an ending no one wished to repeat. Even as memory thinned, avoidance persisted. By the time later populations returned, the original fear had weakened enough to allow curiosity to replace caution. This gradual erosion of memory is inevitable. Each generation distances itself slightly from the experiences that shaped the last. What begins as warning becomes legend. What begins as legend becomes metaphor. Eventually, metaphor loses urgency altogether. Ancient texts anticipate this erosion. They repeat themselves deliberately, They restate themes. They reinforce images. Not because ancient writers lacked imagination, but because they understood how quickly meaning slips away. Repetition was preservation. The laments do not move on quickly. They linger. They circle the same devastation from multiple angles. This persistence mirrors trauma itself, which does not resolve neatly. It replays. It intrudes. It demands acknowledgement. Modern readers sometimes mistake this for excess, but within its original context, it was necessity. To forget too soon was to invite recurrence. To remember was to remain alert. As civilizations grew more confident, this alertness softened. Success bred distance from fear. Cities rose higher. Networks stretched farther. The past became something studied rather than lived. This shift allowed innovation, but it also dulled sensitivity to warning. The ancient world understood that forgetting was not neutral. It carried risk. Memory served as ballast, preventing ambition from drifting too far from reality. When that ballast is lost, systems become lighter, faster, and more fragile. As we move closer to the end of this narrative, the parallels become unavoidable. The ancient experience is not alien. It is familiar in structure, if not in scale. The forces that interrupted their world still exist. The difference is not vulnerability, but awareness. The question that remains is not what destroyed a single city thousands of years ago. It is whether humanity continues to treat memory as inheritance or inconvenience. Because the stories that survive do so not to satisfy curiosity, but to quietly insist that the conditions which once ended everything have never truly disappeared. Disappearance rarely announces itself in advance. It begins at the edges, where memory has thinned enough to be ignored. Confidence grows there first, the belief that this time is different, that understanding has replaced vulnerability, that whatever ended the world before has been rendered obsolete by progress. Ancient cultures recognized this moment instinctively. It was when caution needed reinforcement, not relaxation. Their stories often place catastrophe at the height of prosperity, not during hardship. The city is full, the land is productive, the future appears secure, then everything changes. This pattern is not moral commentary. It is observational. Stability creates density. Density creates exposure. When systems become efficient, they become brittle. When margins shrink, disruption magnifies. The ancient world experienced this through trade networks and agriculture. The modern world experiences it through infrastructure and information. Tall el-Hammam was not a marginal settlement. It was a regional center, integrated into wider systems of exchange. Its sudden absence would have rippled outward, disrupting relationships far beyond its walls. The shock was not confined to those who perished. It extended to those who depended on its continued existence. This is how catastrophe scales. One event destabilizes many lives. Memory forms not only among survivors, but among those indirectly affected. Stories spread faster than people. Fear travels without borders. The sky becomes suspect everywhere, not just where it struck. Ancient texts reflect this diffusion. The laments do not mourn a single city in isolation. They mourn the unraveling of order itself. The destruction of one place becomes a warning to all places. This universality is why the stories endured. They were not local tragedies. They were systemic lessons. Modern analysis sometimes resists this framing, preferring localized explanations. A city fell because of its geography, its resources, its politics. These factors matter, but they do not account for the intensity of memory that followed. They do not explain why the story outlived the city. The intensity suggests that something about the event challenged assumptions at a fundamental level. It was not simply that people died. It was that the rules they trusted failed them. Protection did not protect. Order did not stabilize. The sky did not remain distant. This realization does not lead ancient cultures to despair. It leads them to vigilance, to ritual, to repetition, to embedding caution into identity itself. The goal was not to prevent catastrophe, but to remember its possibility. As this narrative continues, we move toward the final arc, reflection, rather than investigation. Not because questions have been answered, but because the point of memory is not resolution, it is orientation. The ancients left behind ruins and words not as puzzles to be solved, but as signals to be noticed. And the longer those signals persist, the more likely it is that they are pointing not to a single moment in the past, but to a condition that remains with us still, waiting quietly beneath the surface of certainty. Beneath certainty is where the ancients placed their attention. They did not trust permanence because they had seen it fail. Instead, they trusted continuity of memory, the ability to carry awareness forward even when landscapes, languages, and names changed. This is why their stories feel patient. They were written for listeners not yet born. When catastrophe receded into the past, its memory did not vanish. It migrated into symbols that could survive cultural transition. Fire became judgment. Salt became desolation. Smoke became witness. These images were portable. They could move across borders and centuries without losing force. Even when stripped of context, they retained unease. Archaeology occasionally restores that context, but only partially. A layer of ash here, an abandoned valley there, enough to suggest that the symbols were not invented from nothing. They were shaped by encounter, but never enough to satisfy the modern desire for closure. This incompleteness is not a flaw. It is a feature of how deep history operates. Events capable of overwhelming civilization often leave uneven records. The more sudden the destruction, the less time there is to document it. What survives is scattered, indirect, and incomplete. Memory fills the gaps not with precision, but with meaning. In this sense, the ancient response was pragmatic. Precision would not have saved them. Meaning did. It allowed communities to reorganize, to teach restraint, to encode caution into everyday life. The goal was not to reconstruct the event accurately, but to prevent complacency from returning unchecked. Modern culture often reverses this priority. It seeks accuracy first and meaning later, if at all. This inversion creates tension when confronting ancient catastrophe. The evidence feels insufficient. The stories feel exaggerated. The gap becomes uncomfortable. But discomfort may be the point. The ancients were not trying to reassure. They were trying to unsettle just enough to keep awareness alive. Their narratives are not lullabies. They are low-burning warnings, meant to remain in the background, shaping behavior quietly. Tall el-Hammam stands as one of those background signals made visible again. Not because it answers every question, but because it refuses to disappear. Each attempt to classify it completely leaves something unresolved. Heat without fire, destruction without enemy, absence without recovery. This refusal mirrors the ancient texts themselves. They do not resolve. They lament. They repeat. They circle loss without explaining it away. In doing so, they preserve the emotional truth of catastrophe long after factual clarity has eroded. As we approach the final movements of this story, the emphasis shifts from what happened to what endures. Not the mechanism, but the inheritance. Not the event, but the lesson carried forward through time. Because the ancients understood something easily forgotten, that memory is not about the past alone. It is a negotiation with the future. A way of saying, this happened once, and because it happened once, it could happen again. The ruins remain where they fell. The stories remain where they were told. Between them lies a quiet instruction, not to fear the sky endlessly, but to remember that certainty has always been provisional, and that humility has always been civilization's most reliable shelter. Shelter in the ancient sense, was never absolute. Walls could fall, temples could burn, gods themselves could withdraw. What endured was not structure, but awareness. The knowledge that protection was temporary shaped how people lived with uncertainty rather than denying it. This awareness softened ambition without extinguishing it. Ancient civilizations continued to build, trade, and explore, but they did so with an undercurrent of restraint. Expansion was balanced by ritual, prosperity by remembrance. The memory of collapse functioned as a counterweight to confidence. In the laments, this balance is fragile. Hope appears briefly, then recedes. The texts do not rush toward renewal. They linger in loss. This lingering is intentional. It prevents the mind from skipping too quickly to recovery, from bypassing the lesson embedded in devastation. To mourn fully was to remember fully. The biblical tradition follows a similar arc. After destruction, there is silence. Smoke hangs over the valley. The land is altered. Only later does narrative move toward rebuilding elsewhere. Renewal does not occur on the same ground. The place of catastrophe remains marked, set apart. Tall el-Hammam embodies this pause materially. Its ruins do not show immediate succession. There is no smooth transition from destruction to renewal. Instead, there is a void, a span of time where life withdraws. This absence is as meaningful as any structure. It signals that some endings require distance before continuity can resume. Such pauses appear throughout deep history. After major collapses, cultures often retreat, consolidate, simplify. Complexity returns slowly. This pattern is visible after volcanic eruptions, climatic shifts, and large-scale disruptions. Recovery is not a return. It is a reconfiguration. Ancient memory preserves this rhythm, not in timelines, but in tone. Stories slow down. Language becomes heavy. Action yields to reflection. The narrative itself seems to breathe differently, mirroring the societal pause that followed catastrophe. As we reach the edge of this act, the story prepares to transition once more. From catastrophe and reset toward interpretation and theory, toward the questions that arise when enough distance has passed to allow speculation without immediate fear. But before moving forward, the ancient pause must be honored. The silence after destruction, the space where certainty has collapsed and meaning has not yet been rebuilt. This is where memory does its deepest work, shaping what will be carried forward and what will be allowed to fade. In that silence, the ancients did not seek answers. They sought orientation, a way to live knowing that the world could end abruptly and still be worth inhabiting afterward. And it is from that orientation, born of ash and absence, that the next layer of interpretation emerges. From orientation comes interpretation. Only after fear has settled and survival feels possible again does the mind begin to ask how, why, what pattern, if any, can be traced through what remains. This is the moment when memory becomes theory, and when stories begin to shift from witness to explanation. Ancient societies approached this cautiously. They did not rush to define mechanisms. Instead, they asked relational questions. What had been broken in the balance between heaven and earth? Which boundaries had been crossed? What signals had been missed? Interpretation was moral and cosmic before it was mechanical. Over time, as generations passed and direct memory softened, these interpretations diversified. Some emphasized divine judgment. Others emphasized neglect of ritual. Still others framed catastrophe as inevitable cycles written into the structure of the cosmos. None of these views replaced the others. They coexisted, layered like the ruins beneath their cities. This plurality is important. It shows that ancient people were not committed to a single explanation. They were committed to remembering that explanation itself was provisional. That certainty had failed once before and could fail again. In later ages, when scholars encountered these texts without the weight of lived trauma, interpretation shifted again. Symbolic readings gained dominance. Fire from the sky became metaphor. Salted land became moral lesson. The event receded into abstraction, safer to contemplate when stripped of physical consequence. Yet abstraction never fully erased unease. Certain descriptions remained stubborn. Heat that melts stone, winds that scatter bodies, silence that follows instantly. These details resisted comfortable allegory. They felt too specific, too sensory to be dismissed entirely. Modern archaeology reopened this tension. By uncovering sites that matched the consequences described in ancient texts, it reintroduced physicality into stories long treated as symbolic. This did not prove the stories literal. It complicated them. It restored weight to words that had been flattened by distance. At this stage, interpretation becomes contested terrain. Some seek to align text and ruin precisely. Others resist any connection, fearing the collapse of methodological boundaries. Both impulses are understandable. The past is fragile. It can be distorted by enthusiasm as easily as by neglect. The most careful approach occupies the middle ground. It treats ancient texts as records of experience filtered through belief. It treats archaeological evidence as material consequence without narrative. Neither is complete alone. Together, they suggest that ancient catastrophes were real enough to shape culture deeply, even if their causes remain debated. This is where theory enters responsibly, not as declaration, but as exploration, considering multiple possibilities without elevating one prematurely, allowing uncertainty to remain without dismissing significance. As we move deeper into this interpretive phase, the story will examine how symbolic and literal readings have been balanced, confused, and contested across time, and how the desire for definitive answers sometimes reveals more about the present than the past. Because interpretation is never neutral. It reflects the fears, technologies, and assumptions of the age doing the interpreting. And in that reflection, ancient catastrophe continues to speak, not with clarity, but with persistence, reminding each generation that explanation is a process, not a destination. Contestation sharpens focus. When evidence refuses to settle into a single explanation, debate intensifies. This is not failure. It is a sign that the subject touches something unresolved. Ancient catastrophe does not belong neatly to any one discipline, and each attempt to claim it fully exposes the limits of that approach. Symbolic readings emphasize moral structure. They argue that ancient texts functioned primarily as ethical instruction, not historical record. From this perspective, fire from the sky serves to dramatize consequences, not to describe an event. The strength of this view lies in its respect for ancient literary conventions. Its weakness lies in what it leaves unexplained. Material evidence complicates pure symbolism, melted pottery, vitrified surfaces, sudden abandonment. These are not metaphors. They require causes. While symbolism can shape memory, it does not generate physical transformation. Something acted upon these cities regardless of how that action was later understood. Literal readings move in the opposite direction. They seek to align text and ruin as directly as possible, sometimes collapsing centuries and distances to achieve coherence. At their best, these readings honor ancient testimony. At their worst, they project modern concepts backward, distorting original meaning. The challenge is not choosing between these approaches, but recognizing their overlap. Ancient people experienced real events and interpreted them symbolically. They did not separate fact from meaning. They lived them simultaneously. Modern analysis, must account for both dimensions, without privileging one at the expense of the other. This balance becomes especially delicate when extraordinary explanations enter the conversation. Claims of advanced ancient technology or prehistoric warfare capture attention because they offer dramatic resolution. They turn ambiguity into spectacle, but they often do so by bypassing evidence rather than engaging with it. The appeal of such explanations is understandable. They resonate with the intensity of ancient descriptions. They provide a cause commensurate with the effect. But resonance is not validation. The absence of corroborating material evidence matters. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary support. Still, rejecting these theories entirely does not resolve the underlying discomfort. The discomfort arises not from lack of explanation, but from excess of consequence. The evidence suggests an event more severe than typical warfare or accident. That severity demands attention even if its cause remains unknown. This is where responsible interpretation rests. In acknowledging that something extraordinary occurred without insisting on extraordinary causes beyond what evidence can support. To hold space for uncertainty without filling it with speculation. As this narrative continues, it will examine how cycles, astronomy, and environmental forces have been proposed as frameworks for understanding such events. Not as definitive answers, but as contexts that help situate ancient experience within larger patterns that extend beyond individual cities or cultures. Because the ancients did not experience catastrophe in isolation. They experienced it as part of a world whose rhythms they observed carefully, even if they could not control them. And in those rhythms, they suspected recurrence, not randomness. The next movement explores that suspicion. How cycles of sky and earth informed ancient understanding, and how those cycles continue to shape modern thought whenever history confronts us with endings that feel too sudden to be accidental. Suspicion of recurrence is where ancient cosmology and modern science quietly converge. Though separated by language and method, both recognize that the world operates in patterns punctuated by disruption. The ancients watched the sky not because they believed it to be divine theater alone, but because it exhibited repetition. Planets returned, seasons cycled, eclipses could be anticipated once recorded. Within this framework, catastrophe was not anomaly, but interruption within a larger rhythm. If the heavens moved in cycles, then so might destruction. This idea appears repeatedly in ancient thought. Ages begin and end. Worlds are renewed through fire or flood. Civilization rises, collapses, and rises again. Modern astronomy confirms part of this intuition. Earth moves through debris fields. Cometary fragments follow long orbits. Meteor streams intersect the planet's path periodically. Most passes are harmless, some are not. Probability, not intention, governs their arrival. For ancient observers, probability had no language. What they saw was return. Similar signs appearing generations apart. Unusual lights, falling fire, sudden devastation. These experiences reinforced the belief that the sky remembered its own paths, even if humanity could not predict them. This belief shaped how memory was preserved. Stories did not focus on unique dates or singular events. They emphasized pattern, fire from above, land rendered barren, survivors fleeing. These elements could apply whenever the pattern repeated, making the memory transferable across time. In this light, the laments and biblical narratives function less as historical reports and more as pattern recognition. They describe what happens when a certain threshold is crossed, regardless of when or where. The value lies in the structure, not the timestamp. Tall el-Hammam may represent one such crossing, not the only one, but one that left enough material trace to reawaken ancient suspicion in modern minds. The city appears to have been caught at the wrong moment, intersecting with forces that operate on scales beyond local control. Cycles do not require predictability to be real. They require only recurrence. Even irregular patterns leave signatures that attentive cultures notice. The ancients noticed. They recorded. They warned. Modern culture notices differently. Data replaces story. Models replace myth. But the underlying recognition remains. The world is not static. It contains intervals of calm, punctuated by sudden change. As this act moves forward, the narrative will examine how ancient ideas of cycles, including concepts like reset and renewal, intersect with modern discussions of environmental thresholds and cosmic risk. Not to equate them, but to explore why certain intuitions persist despite radical shifts in knowledge. Because when civilizations confront evidence of sudden endings, they reach instinctively for the same questions. Is this isolated or recurring? Accidental or patterned? And most importantly, remembered or forgotten? The ancients chose remembrance. Their stories endure as echoes of a world that learned, perhaps too late, that the sky does not only mark time, it sometimes interrupts it. Interruption reshapes how time itself is felt. After catastrophe, the future no longer stretches smoothly forward. It becomes segmented, cautious, provisional. Ancient cultures expressed this through myths of renewal and reset, not because they expected an identical world to return, but because they needed a way to imagine continuation after rupture. These reset narratives appear across civilizations. Worlds destroyed by flood, ages ended by fire, humanity reduced and reconstituted. Such stories are not fantasies of erasure. They are frameworks for survival. They say the end has happened before and life continued afterward. Memory becomes reassurance as much as warning. In Mesopotamian thought, destruction and creation were intertwined. The same divine forces that established order could dismantle it. This did not make the gods unreliable. It made them consistent within a cyclical system. Order was not permanent. It was renewable, provided lessons were remembered. Modern readers often misinterpret this as pessimism. In reality, it is conditional optimism. The future is possible, but not guaranteed. It depends on alignment with forces larger than human ambition. Whether those forces are framed as divine, natural, or cosmic depends on the language of the age. Tall el-Hammam, seen through this lens, is not simply a tragedy. It is a marker. A point where one configuration of human settlement ended and another eventually emerged elsewhere. The reset did not restore what was lost. It redirected it. Archaeological gaps are often treated as failures to be explained away. But gaps are themselves data. They represent periods of reassessment, migration, and adaptation. People did not disappear. They moved. They reorganized. They carried memory into new landscapes. Ancient texts preserve this movement indirectly. Survivors appear traveling, settling in unfamiliar regions, negotiating new identities. These narratives emphasize continuity of lineage over continuity of place. Home becomes something that can be rebuilt, not something guaranteed by geography. This flexibility was essential. It allowed civilizations to endure repeated disruption without collapsing entirely. Memory traveled with people, not stones. Stories outlived walls. In modern discourse, reset is often framed as loss alone. But ancient perspectives complicate this. Reset is painful, but it is also generative. It clears assumptions that no longer serve survival. It forces reconfiguration. It reminds humanity of limits. As we continue, the narrative will explore how these ancient ideas of reset resonate with modern discussions about collapse and renewal, climate shifts, environmental thresholds, technological risk, different causes, similar structures. The value of ancient memory lies not in predicting specific events, but in modeling how societies live with the knowledge that resets are possible, that progress is real but fragile, and that what survives catastrophe is rarely infrastructure, but the capacity to remember, adapt, and begin again with humility rather than certainty. Humility alters the trajectory of renewal. When civilizations rebuild with awareness rather than denial, their structures reflect caution learned through loss. This is visible in how ancient societies reoriented themselves after collapse. Power decentralizes, excess is restrained, memory is institutionalized through story, ritual, and law. These adaptations are rarely permanent. Over generations, success dulls their urgency. What began as necessity becomes tradition. What began as warning becomes ceremony. Eventually, meaning thins. The cycle resumes. This erosion is not failure. It is human. Memory competes with immediacy. The present always feels more real than the past. Ancient cultures understood this weakness and worked against it by embedding reminders into everyday life. Festivals commemorated destruction as well as creation. Myths were retold not because they were entertaining, but because they carried encoded restraint. The stories of cities destroyed by fire from the sky served this purpose. They were not recited to frighten children, but to orient adults, to remind leaders that prosperity had limits, to remind communities that alignment mattered more than dominance. Tall el-Hammam re-enters this pattern thousands of years later as an unexpected messenger. Its ruins do not preach. They simply exist. They ask no allegiance to theory or belief. They confront the present with material evidence that ancient warnings were not imaginary. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it resists moral framing. The site does not reveal corruption punished or virtue rewarded. It reveals vulnerability exposed, a city caught in conditions that exceeded its capacity to respond. This is a harder lesson to integrate because it offers no clear corrective action beyond awareness itself. Modern discourse often seeks agency, someone to blame, something to fix. Ancient memory, by contrast, often emphasized acceptance of limits, not resignation, but recognition, acknowledging that some forces cannot be negotiated with, only respected. As this act approaches its close, the narrative turns towards synthesis rather than resolution. What can be held together without forcing coherence? Text and ruin, memory and measurement, fear and humility. The ancients did not resolve these tensions, they lived with them. They allowed contradiction to exist without insisting on closure. This flexibility may have been one of their greatest strengths. In the final movement of this story, the focus will shift toward release, not abandonment of inquiry, but quiet acceptance that some truths do not arrive as answers. They arrive as orientation, a way of standing in the world with eyes open, aware that stability is provisional and that memory, however fragile, is the most reliable inheritance humanity has ever carried forward. Orientation does not demand certainty. It demands attention. The ancients understood that to live well in an unpredictable world, one must remain aware of thresholds rather than illusions of permanence. Their stories did not promise safety. They offered awareness as a form of shelter. This is why ancient catastrophe narratives often end without resolution. There is no final explanation, no guarantee against repetition. Instead, there is release into vigilance, a quiet understanding that life continues not because danger has vanished, but because memory has learned how to carry it. In modern terms, this posture can feel unsatisfying. We prefer answers that close questions, solutions that eliminate risk. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that risk cannot be eliminated, only managed. The ancient approach did not deny this, it integrated it. Tall el-Hammam becomes meaningful here not as proof of any single theory, but as a reminder that even advanced societies can be caught unprepared by forces that operate beyond human timescales. The ruins are not warnings about morality or technology. They are warnings about overconfidence. This reframing shifts the conversation away from spectacle and toward reflection. The question is no longer whether ancient people witnessed something extraordinary, but whether modern people recognize that the extraordinary has always been possible. That progress does not exempt a civilization from interruption. The ancients lived closer to this awareness because they had fewer buffers. When disaster struck, it struck directly. Modern systems absorb shock differently, distributing it across networks that can fail invisibly until collapse becomes sudden and total. The pattern is familiar, even if the scale has changed. In this sense, ancient memory is not obsolete. It is underutilized. The stories preserved in clay and scripture are not blueprints for fear, but maps of humility. They show how societies made sense of loss without surrendering to despair. As we near the end of this journey, the pace slows deliberately. Reflection replaces investigation, not because curiosity has been exhausted, but because the lesson lies not in accumulation of facts, but in the space they create. The ancients left that space open on purpose. They did not seal their stories with conclusions. They allowed silence to remain. In that silence, each generation was invited to place itself within the narrative, to ask not what happened then, but how awareness shapes what happens next. And in that question, the cycle of memory continues, not as repetition of catastrophe, but as continuity of attention, the quiet discipline that allows civilization to exist, knowing it is never guaranteed. Attention, once cultivated, changes how endings are perceived. They are no longer only losses. They become transitions that demand care. The ancient world understood this intuitively. Endings were not erased. They were folded into identity, shaping how beginnings were approached. In the aftermath of catastrophe, ancient societies did not rush to restore what had been lost. They paused. They marked the rupture. They allowed grief to become structure. This pause is visible in ritual calendars, in memorial texts, in the deliberate spacing of time between destruction and renewal. Memory required room to settle. Modern culture often bypasses this space. Recovery is framed as speed. Resilience is measured by how quickly normalcy returns. Yet ancient memory suggests that returning too quickly risks repeating the conditions that allowed catastrophe to strike unexamined. Slowness was not weakness, it was protection. Tall el-Hammam's long silence embodies this principle materially. The absence of immediate rebuilding was not inefficiency. It was distance, time inserted deliberately between the event and any attempt to continue. Whether motivated by fear, environmental reality, or both, the effect was the same. Memory was allowed to imprint deeply. The laments perform a similar function in language. They slow the narrative. They repeat loss. They resist forward momentum. This resistance ensures that destruction is not absorbed too easily into continuity. It must be carried consciously before anything new can take shape. In later generations, this discipline becomes harder to maintain. Distance weakens urgency. New challenges demand attention. Old warnings feel less relevant. Memory thins. This is when cycles quietly prepare to repeat, not because catastrophe seeks return, but because awareness has softened. Ancient cultures attempted to counter this through inheritance, not genetic, but narrative. Stories told to children who had never seen the ruins themselves. Rituals enacted by people who did not remember their origin. Meaning survived through repetition even when context faded. This inheritance is fragile. It depends on willingness to listen. When stories are dismissed as outdated or symbolic alone, their practical function dissolves. What remains is aesthetic appreciation without caution. As this narrative approaches its final act, the emphasis rests on this fragility, not as accusation, but as observation. Memory requires maintenance. It must be revisited, not to relive fear, but to preserve perspective. The ancients did not believe memory would prevent catastrophe entirely. They believed it would shape response. That when the unexpected arrived, people would recognize its significance and act with humility rather than panic or denial. This belief carries forward into the quiet space at the end of the story, a recognition that history's value lies not in certainty, but in orientation, and that orientation, once lost, must be patiently rebuilt, just as ancient societies rebuilt themselves, slowly, attentively, with the weight of remembrance guiding every step. Orientation, when sustained, becomes wisdom rather than fear. The ancients did not live in constant dread of catastrophe. They lived with an awareness that shaped proportion. Joy was possible because it was not assumed to be permanent. Prosperity was valued because it was understood to be conditional. This balance allowed life to remain meaningful even under the shadow of uncertainty. In their stories, catastrophe never erased the future. It redefined it. After destruction, there was always movement. Survivors traveled, communities reformed. Knowledge was carried forward, altered but intact. Memory functioned not as a chain binding the present to the past, but as a compass pointing toward humility. This is why ancient narratives rarely conclude with triumph. They conclude with continuation. The world does not end. It changes. People adapt. Civilization resumes, not because danger has passed, but because life insists on expression even within constraint. Tall el-Hammam, viewed through this lens, is not a symbol of annihilation, but of redirection. Its story does not end in ash. It continues through the people who left, the regions that absorbed them, the memories that traveled beyond the valley. The city vanished, but its lesson did not. Modern analysis often seeks closure where none exists. We want to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and whether it can happen again. These are reasonable questions, but ancient memory offers a different priority. Not knowing is acceptable if awareness is preserved. Explanation is secondary to posture. This posture is what survives across cultures and centuries. A quiet readiness, a refusal to mistake stability for permanence, a respect for forces that operate beyond human planning. These qualities are not relics of a pre-scientific age. They are adaptive traits, refined through experience. As we prepare to move into the final reflections, the narrative releases the need for definitive answers, not because inquiry has failed, but because its purpose has been fulfilled. The past has spoken as clearly as it can through ruins and words. What remains is listening. Listening to the silence left behind by abandoned cities. Listening to the repetition embedded in ancient texts. Listening to the discomfort that arises when evidence resists simplification. These are not obstacles to understanding. They are the understanding. The ancients left no instruction manual for survival. They left something more subtle, a pattern of attention, a way of holding uncertainty without surrendering to it. And as the story begins its final descent toward quiet, that pattern remains, steady and patient, waiting to be noticed again whenever certainty grows too loud. When certainty grows loud, memory lowers its voice. It does not compete. It waits. This patience is its strength. Across millennia, ancient warnings have survived not because they demanded attention, but because they endured neglect. They remained intact long enough to be rediscovered when confidence faltered. In the final act of this story, the pace slows further. Investigation yields to contemplation, not because the past has been exhausted, but because it has offered what it can. Ruins cannot explain themselves. Texts cannot defend their own ambiguity. What remains is the listener's relationship to what has been uncovered. The ancients would have recognized this moment. It is the space after meaning has been extracted and before it hardens into doctrine. A space where humility can still enter, where the lesson has not yet been converted into certainty or dismissed as irrelevance. Civilizations often struggle here. The temptation is to resolve discomfort by choosing a side, to declare the past fully understood or entirely unknowable. Both positions close the conversation. Both eliminate the tension that keeps awareness alive. Ancient memory resisted this closure intentionally. It preserved contradiction. Gods were powerful yet fallible. Order was sacred yet fragile. Catastrophe was devastating yet survivable. These tensions were not errors. They were reflections of lived reality. In modern terms, this may feel unsatisfying. We are trained to seek clarity, to isolate variables, to draw conclusions. Yet the deepest historical experiences resist this treatment. They spill beyond categories. They linger. Tall el-Hammam lingers in this way. It remains neither solved nor dismissed. It occupies a threshold state, forcing acknowledgement without providing comfort. It asks for attention without offering resolution. In doing so, it fulfills the ancient function of memory perfectly. The same is true of the laments and destruction narratives that echo across cultures. They do not tell us what to believe. They tell us what to remember. That the world can change abruptly. That prosperity is not immunity. That awareness must be renewed continually, or it fades. As the story approaches its conclusion, this is what remains. Not fear, not speculation, but orientation. A way of standing within history that recognizes both achievement and vulnerability without privileging one over the other. The ancients did not imagine the future as safe. They imagined it as possible. Possibility was enough. It allowed for creativity, rebuilding, and joy, tempered by respect for limits. This balance sustained civilizations longer than certainty ever could. And so the memory persists, quietly, patiently, waiting for moments like this, when the noise recedes just enough for ancient echoes to be heard again, not as commands or predictions, but as reminders that attention itself is a form of inheritance. Inheritance, when understood deeply, is not about possession. It is about posture. The ancients did not pass down certainty or solutions. They passed down attentiveness, a way of looking at the world that remained open to interruption without collapsing into despair. This posture shaped how they approached the unknown. They did not assume safety, but they did not abandon hope. They accepted that forces beyond their control existed and structured their lives accordingly. Ritual, story, and remembrance were not distractions from reality. They were tools for living within it. Over time, these tools became subtle. Memory no longer needed to shout. It embedded itself into rhythms of life, seasonal observances, story cycles, architectural choices. Even silence carried meaning. What was not rebuilt spoke as loudly as what was. Tall el-Hammam participates in this silent inheritance. Its ruins do not demand belief. They simply persist. They remind anyone who encounters them that civilization has edges, that there are moments when preparation fails, when explanation lags behind experience, when survival depends not on strength but on adaptability. In this sense, ancient catastrophe narratives are not pessimistic. They are realistic. They do not claim that disaster can be avoided forever. They claim that it can be survived if awareness is preserved, that memory itself is a form of continuity stronger than stone. Modern civilization inherits this posture whether it acknowledges it or not. Every warning system, Every redundancy, every contingency plan reflects an ancient intuition that stability is temporary, that vigilance is necessary, that forgetting carries risk. What differs now is scale. Systems are larger, interconnections tighter, the margin for error thinner. This does not make ancient memory irrelevant. It makes it urgent, not because the same events will repeat in the same form, but because the pattern of interruption remains. As the story settles toward its close, there is no revelation to unveil, no hidden mechanism finally exposed. The value lies elsewhere, in recognizing that the ancients were not merely storytellers of myth, but custodians of lived experience translated into forms that could survive time. Their message was not one of fear, but of proportion. Know what you have built. Know what it rests upon. Remember that continuity is earned, not guaranteed. And in that remembering, civilization finds its quiet strength, not in denial of vulnerability, but in acceptance of it. A balance the ancients understood well enough to preserve in clay and story, trusting that someday someone would listen again. Listening again is an act of humility. It requires setting aside the expectation that the past must resolve itself into answers suited to the present. The ancients did not preserve memory so it could be mastered. They preserved it so it could be approached carefully, with the understanding that some truths arrive only as orientation, not instruction. In the quiet after inquiry, something subtle emerges. The realization that catastrophe is not the opposite of civilization, but part of its environment. Just as seasons shape agriculture, interruption shapes history. The question is not whether disruption will occur, but how societies carry themselves in its shadow. Ancient narratives do not teach avoidance, they teach recognition. To recognize when confidence has outpaced awareness, when complexity has narrowed tolerance, when systems depend too heavily on continuity without contingency. These recognitions are not dramatic. They are quiet adjustments in posture. The laments, the ruins, the long silences between occupation layers all speak to this same discipline. They do not ask for fear. They ask for proportion, for the ability to hold achievement and fragility together without collapsing into either arrogance or despair. Tall el-Hammam stands as one more place where this discipline can be relearned, not as proof of divine wrath or lost technology, but as evidence that history sometimes accelerates faster than preparation, that even well-established worlds can end without warning, and that memory is often the only thing that bridges one world to the next. As night deepens and attention softens, the urgency of explanation recedes. What remains is presence, the awareness that ancient people were not fundamentally different in their fears or hopes. They built, they prospered, they trusted, and they were surprised. What distinguished them was not ignorance, but memory hard-earned. They chose to remember disruption without letting it define them entirely. They continued to plant, to teach, to tell stories. They accepted that the sky could bring beauty or ruin, and they lived anyway, guided by attentiveness rather than certainty. This is the inheritance they left. Not a warning carved in stone, but a way of standing in the world that remains relevant whenever stability feels complete and progress feels inevitable. And as the story draws toward its final release, it offers no command, no conclusion, only a quiet invitation. To carry memory lightly but seriously, to recognize that the past is not distant but layered beneath every present moment, and to remember, as the ancients did, that continuity is never given. It is practiced, patiently, one attentive generation at a time. Practice, in the end, is what remains. Not belief, not certainty, practice. The quiet, repeated choice to remember that the world has edges and that crossing them has consequences that cannot always be predicted or undone. The ancients practiced memory the way others practice craft, carefully, repeatedly, with humility. They knew that forgetting was easy and remembering required effort, so they pressed stories into clay. They rebuilt cities with altered priorities. They left some places empty on purpose. These were not accidents. They were disciplines. In time, even those disciplines softened. Nothing practiced by humans remains perfect forever. Yet enough endured, enough survived erosion, conquest, translation, and reinterpretation to reach us now, not as commands from the past, but as quiet companions. Tall el-Hammam is one such companion. It does not accuse, it does not explain itself. It simply exists, holding a moment when continuity failed and memory began its long work. Around it swirl texts, theories, debates, and doubts. But beneath all of that is something simpler, a reminder that civilization has always been provisional. The Sumerian laments understood this. So did the biblical storytellers. So did countless unnamed survivors who carried memory forward without knowing where it would land. They did not expect the future to solve what the past could not. They expected the future to listen. Listening does not require agreement. It requires presence, the willingness to let ancient unease coexist with modern confidence, to allow uncertainty to remain without rushing to erase it, to accept that some histories do not conclude because their purpose is not to end, but to orient. As this story releases you back into the present, nothing is asked of you. No belief, no conclusion, only awareness. The same awareness ancient people cultivated when they looked at the sky with respect rather than assumption. The world is still here. Civilization continues. Memory persists beneath it all, quiet and patient. Not warning of doom, not promising safety, but offering something more enduring, perspective. And in that perspective, the past and present touch briefly, gently, reminding us that what has been lost before can teach us how to remain human when certainty fades, and how to move forward without forgetting that even the strongest foundations rest ultimately on attention.